Okay, welcome everyone. Great to see all of you here. I'm really pleased to introduce Jon Freeman, who will talk to us about how we can build systems and organizations that support care. Um, and of course, that's such a key issue in our current economic and political climate, where we face massive constraints and we're seeing reorganizations, redundancies, bed closures. We're all in survival mode. So, John studied human sciences at Oxford University. And following his studies, he then worked in business as an information systems architect and IT director. He led change programs in several big organizations, companies, including British Airways, Vodafone, and O2. And he continued to study science and human systems. So, John is an author. He's published several books, including Reinventing Capitalism and the Science of Possibility. And he's about to publish his latest book, What Makes You You, which is hopefully coming out next week. Um, John is now a trainer, a coach, and a business consultant through his company Spiral Futures, which draws on spiral dynamics, which is a development theory which works with individuals and organizations as living systems. What is particularly helpful to us is that John is the chair of trustees of the Shaling Ringwood organisation. So the Shaling is a charity that offers care and education to young people with special needs. And John has been involved with them for 20 years and has supported the company through major change. And trauma informed working is absolutely core to how they work. So, John is going to share with us how he sees the nature of personal and organizational resilience as really inseparable, and the experience of trauma as being central to those dynamics. We will record the presentation, so if you want to turn off your camera, you're welcome to do so. Okay, thanks very much, and over to you, John.
You, okay, the
I
recording
don't
is
want
going
if
now.
you want to start again, or I forgot to press the button. Do you
Okay,
want to start again, and then I'll edit out the missed bit.
okay. So, yeah, the orientation is what does it take for an organization to deliver first-class care when you're dealing with the complexity of people's individual needs, you're dealing with the context of trauma, which clearly is central to your group, and I will certainly be going into that, and with an awareness that the conditions that your organizations are in are also stressed. So there's an internal and an external stress context. Um, so what what do I know about this? I know very little about palliative care. I had a former partner who died from cancer in Salisbury hospice rather, 18 months ago. So I've sort of experienced what it is to be in that environment and see what goes on, but I'm not a practitioner, evidently. And I also have very little knowledge of the NHS, but I am chair of trustees for a charity that provides care and education to young people with special educational needs. And there is a context with that of always having to deal with the trauma that's present in the young people who have their own challenges, sometimes quite severe, and the parents and other family members who are associated with them. So in that sense, there's a certain degree of comparability to what I imagine is the case with working in hospices. And then a lot of what I'm going to say is based on the fact that all organizations have a lot of characteristics that are shared. I've never met an organization that didn't think it was unique, even ones who were in the same industry as each other. And they were all right in that sense. And they were all, I would say, equally lacking in the understanding of how much of what we deal with is just generic to what it takes to be and operate in an organization. So I'm going to try and do something that I haven't done before, which is I want to weave together three strands, all of which I see as kind of integral to the notion of what it is to be an organization, what it is to live in that organization. I mean, live in the day-to-day sense of spending however many hours you do there. And I want to present that firstly with a particular context for what trauma is. And that's very strongly informed by a book which I think is quite brilliant and which I've been reading quite recently. And that's Gabor Mate's book called The Myth of Normal. And Gabor Mate, you may have come across, he's very well known for his books on trauma, and particularly his previous books which relate that to the development of addiction. But where he's gone in this latest book is he relates the way that we are, the way that our individual health operates, the way that addictions develop, all the way through to what's the nature of the life conditions that we all are existing in, all the way up to where we are in a kind of an evolutionary sense in how we operate as a society and what that does to us and for us. And that feeds into the components of development, because the core of this presentation is around spiral dynamics, which looks at the way that individuals and organizations develop through a set of kind of stages which have similar causes for why they are the way they are, even though that looks different when you're looking from the perspective of the individual as distinct from the organization. And then on top of that, I'm going to layer a little extra complexity, which comes from Ken Wilber's four-quadrant integral model, where we'll kind of relate the individual and the system together in seeing all of that. So this is a very systemic view, and that may be natural to some of you, and it may be not natural to others. I hope I can make it easy, painless. And I want to start with this question of, well, what do we mean by trauma? Because this first quote, it is hard to imagine the scope of an individual life without envisioning some kind of trauma, and it is hard for most people to know what to do about it. And I'm starting from there because what I saw, what Jeanette shared with me from what seems to be the kind of literature in this area, seems to be quite focused on the large scale of trauma in an individual. So the things that may be the major life incidents, being abused, going through bereavement, suffering in war or whatever. And of course, those are part of people's experience, and they may be part of what your patients and clients bring into the scenario when they come into a hospice. But much more significant from my point of view is what I'm calling little t trauma, because the reality that I see and which Gabor Mate articulates so well is that in fact none of us is free from damage, and all of us have developed our coping strategies, the way that we deal with, oh, this is what's happened in my life, and this is what I developed as the way that I function, and that's what I show up with in my life and my work. And we may think of it as if that's somebody's personality, and in a sense, it is that too. But it's not hardwired in the sense that, people are largely, let's say they're introverts or they're extroverts, and that's not going to significantly change. Whereas things that we show up with as coping strategies or that are ways that we have developed, they are ultimately things that we can change. But seeing trauma with its big T and only relating to that to what's going on for the patient, I think that undervalues the nature of stress in the organization itself. It undervalues the nature of stress for people who are doing what's really quite an emotionally demanding set of jobs in those systems, which may themselves be under stress. And so I want to kind of get a sense of how that actually works out in practice, because that reality that anybody may also any of us may be bringing in big T trauma into the environment. It's not just patients, but that everyone carries the little t trauma and has their coping strategies. That then arrives in the reality that being sick is a trauma. I mean, particularly terminal illness, obviously, is, that faces people with the most fundamental emotional issues that can show up for anyone. And that all through this, the caring that your hospices deliver, they involve relationships and they bring emotional demands. And then you're dealing with not just the patient, but with the family system, which is also bringing in its own demands of the situation and the history of the family, because they will have their own unresolved issues. I mean, you know, people pull together, hopefully, when they're dealing with the situation of a family member dying. But, they may not have forgotten the argument they had last Christmas. So we're dealing with the fact that all of this stress and all of this trauma, it inhabits the system at various levels. And at the same time, what I'm suggesting and what I'm hoping that you will see in what I'm
I'm just emailing you. That's better to talk.
describing, that what you'll see
Yeah.
is
Sorry, I'm on a web.
so this crucial sense for me, and what I've certainly seen in the way that the Sheeling operates, is that care is indivisible. It's a whole system function. And so I'm really going to talk about what does it take to achieve that? What does even having that ambition look like? So I'm going to now deliver the simplest version I can of spiral dynamics and the sense of the inner voices that are in you and are in your organization, and how these arise and how they relate to each other. So to see the system both through the lens of individuals and through the lens of the organization, and to see the sense of how those dovetail together. So I'm going to talk about this developmental sequence, and you're looking from the bottom up, because what we see for individuals is that the first need, and if any of you have come across Maslow, this is also what you would find in Maslow's adaptations, that the first stage is our survival. And for the individual, where that starts is our being nurtured, as well as finding our safety to continue to exist. So we grow up, we start as infants, and infants are in a state where they have to be cared for. They don't survive if they're not nurtured. And so that is fundamental to who people are and how they are within themselves. And all of these stages that I'm going to describe, see them as voices, see them as layers. We use the different labels kind of interchangeably, but the importance of seeing them as voices is they don't go away. You don't stop needing to survive when you move into the next stage. So the next stage that is important to human development is what we experience when we're kind of beyond the first stages of infancy, where maybe we're crawling, we're in a more of an interactive relationship with our family. And that's where we establish our fundamental bonds, the sense of being safe in the world, being safe in our relationships with our families. And that's where people establish their core sense of being rooted in the world. And I will come back and talk about what can go wrong with that and what's important about that. But just kind of wanting to lodge you initially with the sense that that safety is a very fundamental part of who each of us becomes. So the third stage, any of you who have children or have lived around young children will know the third stage. It's the stage at which children start to use words like no and mine, and it's what you would know as the terrible twos. And it can be quite difficult both for child and parents, because this is the point at which we establish our identity and our sense of who we are. So we grow out of that background of the safety of the family in setting up our individuality, learning what it is to be me, and what it is to find where do I have power in my life? Who can I be? What can I shape? And there's a lot of impulse that comes out of that process of discovering myself, because it arises from within, and then it kind of hits the outside world and the things that parents expect and the things that are going on around, that where we can't have what we want. And that's why we see temper tantrums, because it's quite hard to deal with. Well, that dynamic sits within us. It doesn't go away. I'll also talk about what can go wrong with that, because it can affect each of us individually. But it doesn't last forever, and what we also know is that eventually children begin to transition out of that, and they reach kindergarten age, they go to school, and they learn the fourth inner voice, which is about the codes we live by, the sense of order, the sense of how do we manage being part of collectives in a bigger way. I mean, the purple stage was also a collective, but it was a quite confined collective. Blue is much more what you're familiar with as, members of society, members of a workplace, members of organizations that are outside your workplace, your, whatever that might be, your clubs, your faith groups. And we learn as codes to the codes that we live by, and we do that mainly through the kind of 4 to 12 years as we go through primary school. And then something else happens, which is us establishing our identity in the world. So it's one thing to develop our internal sense of who I am, but then there becomes a sense of, well, who am I going to be in this world? And teenagers go through that. They may play with lots of different peer groups that they share an identity with, and they'll test things out. And we all have, at that point, we kind of pull away from our parents because we're establishing a new level of our individual identity. And that's quite a potent, outgoing sense of establishing the I. And there's an oscillation through all of this between the stages which are about me and the stages which are about the collective and how do we fit in. And that's a built-in life tension between cooperation and collaboration and competition. That's the nature of all life. So the last stage for now, for the individual, is where we also come out of that stage of establishing my identity in the world to how do we bond together. And that green stage is very fundamental to most care systems and people who are in care systems, because they're there out of a sense that, well, this is what's important to me. Caring for others is important, and how we bond together as a collective is important. So let me now move into the organizational perspective on that, which has the same inner sense to it, but it shows up in a way that relates to the living nature of the organization and what it goes through. And of course, when you come into an organization, whether it's a company or hospice or whatever, you don't have the same experience typically of going through its growth from the start. If I was talking to a different audience, I could talk about how this pattern shows up in startups. If you're an entrepreneur, then you experience going through exactly the same stages as individuals go through. You experience the organization having that developmental process. And at the basis of that is, well, the organization first has to find its finances and become solvent. And so there is the survival base in that organization. And of course, if you're looking at it in hindsight and in the experience of what's going on in the world at the moment with funding cuts and so on, actually that beige stage, that nature of survival and solvency, is impacting you strongly. And so it is part of what is sitting there as the base layer of the organization, affecting the way that you operate. The purple stage, the second stage, safety, purpose, and belonging. When an organization is starting, it comes in, it has a reason for its existence. And you have in your hospices, I would expect, typically a very strong sense of why are we here? What is it we're here to do? And that sense of purpose and how we belong together, and how we navigate the way that we belong as individuals in the system, and that belonging may be fluid as different individuals come and go. And it's also the nature of the belonging that is there for the for your patients and families, because they're temporary belongers, but their sense of being held and being safe in that context is part of who they are and what makes the process work for them. Power and empowerment are typically important in the organization because some people are seen to have power, some people are seen not to have power. We deal with how we manage our relationship, what is it to empower ourselves to be in the context of systems which seem to be operating maybe against that, and what is it in that context to deal with potentially managers or bosses whose version of power is power over rather than power to, which is empowerment. Their version of power over is telling people what to do and getting angry and bullying when that doesn't happen. And that also can be kind of endemic to an organization. The blue stage, the codes to live by, you will be very familiar with all of that because you know that your organization has structure. Valerie, can you mute yourself, please? Okay, thank you. You know you have structures you work with. You know you have processes you have to follow. I mean, increasingly, it's been really intense over the past 10 years for the Shealing School, that the whole Ofsted process and the sense of a tick box culture that comes from being inspected. You will have your own versions of those, some of which are things that the processes are there for really good reasons and because that's what makes care work. And sometimes they're things which are about making other people happy more than they are about doing the job that you need to do. So that blue layer is very central to any organization of any kind, but it's maybe shows up in its particular way inside the hospice context. So the orange stage of who are we in the world and how does that look for the individual, that shows up in organizations in finding the excellence in performance, evolving their strategies to be the best that they can. And also, it may be about establishing your reputation in the world, about being seen by the world around you as, oh, this is a place that I would want a loved one to be at the end stage of their life. So all of those kind of aspects, they sit in the orange frame and the orange lens through which you might be looking at the organization. Green is, as before, it's kind of more obvious because the sharing, the caring, the taking account of diversity, finding harmony with others, that's kind of built in to what you know you need to do and are endeavoring to do. And then at the top, I've put the yellow stage, which I didn't talk about in individuals, but that is about the fact that ultimately all of these voices, they all exist within us, they all exist within the organization, they all have their place, they all have their value, and somehow we have to be able to integrate them all. And that, I apologize, I'm going through quite a complex picture at quite high speed. but I hope it makes some sense. I will unpack it a little bit more in the next slides, but just recognize that as we've gone through that organizational journey, you're dealing at one level with the entire history of the NHS and what it's evolved to be as an organization and how that affects the context specifically for hospices. So I'll just recap quickly that these are our personal lenses on the world, our biological existence and the aspects of beings that arise from our genetics, our epigenetics, and our incarnational templates. They're what we land with in the world. That sits at the root of who you are. You have the formation during infancy of the connection to family, tribe, and environment. The place that you are is part of that. The emergence in the red stage of will and individuality, building the foundations of who we are, and the healthy sense of an ego that can sustain that and that can stand in difficult conditions without crumbling. The sense of order and the collective identity as sits in processes and the moral structure that we operate in. All of those are our codes to live by. They may, in some contexts, have an overarching religious system behind them or a particular society behind them. The orange, the excellence and strategy, being the best we can be and how we show up in the world and feeling a sense that we are esteemed, and the belonging and mutuality of finding harmony, caring and diversity. And all of that, every one of those aspects is a foundational harmonic of your selfhood. We all need to feel physically and psychologically secure, and we need to know who we are and who we can be and what is expected of us. So all of those stages, they remain present once they're activated. And so if, I maybe don't have time for you to do this, but I just want to kind of give you a sense of when you look at this, what would it be to get in touch with the part of you that is scared of dying, or the part of you that is threatened by global warming, that sense of beige vulnerability? What's your relationship with your roots? Where were your beginnings, and how does that inhabit you and who you are? How do you respond maybe to strong bosses, or when do you go into compliance? Or does it feel okay for you to assert yourself, or does that actually feel like I'm not supposed to do that? Would you see yourself as egotistical if you were assertive or more assertive? How do you react internally when other people break the rules? How much flexibility do you allow yourself when you're interpreting rules and processes and trying to deal with, actually, I'm trying to care for this person and I've got all these boxes I want to tick or I'm supposed to tick, but that's actually not what I feel I'm here for. So all of those questions, they're actually day-to-day living questions. They're not just a theory, they're parts of who we are. And what can be difficult about that is the nature of what happens with trauma and in trauma, that what goes wrong with all of those stages is that those foundational harmonics in us as individuals, they get disrupted. So for you or for the individuals you're caring for or others you're working with, the underlying fear that we will not survive, or in the case of the terminally ill, the actual fear of dying, that's there, that's present, and that's part of what may inhabit any of us that we bring into the context, that if your fear of your economic survival is threatened, that actually inhabits you and how you show up in relation to the fears that are in others and in the system. So there's a list here, and I'll go quickly because there's a lot to cover. The fear that we don't belong, the feeling of disconnection, that if attachment doesn't work in childhood, we maybe don't have the attachment to parents and connection to family, or we don't have that sense of personal purpose and vocation. That can be actually missing from who we grow up to be. The fear that we can't be who we are and will be shamed if we actually show up with all of us. So we suppress our identity, or we have insecure boundaries that we don't know where those boundaries are. The fear that we will be wrong and punished if we break the rules, that inhabits how do I navigate the process of living with others or working with systems. Fearing that we'll not be recognized or that we can't achieve. And, for some people, maybe the fear that no one cares, or that we're in a situation where there's a conflict and we can't get past it, and the care and bonding is absent from the system. So these are all living things that are happening with us, that the bottom line is what they cause is nervous system dysregulation. We actually, we get, that's what stress is. So again, here, if you look back at these slides, notice what feels real to you in the world, in your world. Notice which one of these maybe resonates for you more strongly than any others. And we all know that what dysregulation shows up as is stress, poor sleep, irritability, being anxious, being impatient, tension headaches, sugar cravings, and all the things that we might then bring into what we do with that reality, which is that we find our coping strategies, or we see others working with their coping strategies. So at the base level, people who are really threatened, they may just cut off. They will go into a sense of low life force and, almost catatonia. And of course, there are things with palliative care which maybe go with that because people are being administered with drugs that kind of take them into that less conscious space, or the life force is being depleted simply by the process that they're going through physically. So those disruptions show up in us and in people. We may become detached from the organization if we're not coping well with what's going on in the purple stage. We may see the disempowerment and submission, or the bullying and power games that show up in the organization, and how we cope with those, how we deal with our own compliance or our rebellion in relation to the superiors and the processes. Maybe the places where we can't activate who we really want to be, we settle for less, we become unmotivated. If we're not recognized, we go into resentment, non-recognition. All of these can close down who we are, how we show up, and how much of ourselves we bring into the workplace. And likewise, the green context of the collective, we can go passive, or we can get into where we stir other people up because we want some collective support for what we individually think needs to be happening. All of these are kind of living dynamics in a living system. And those coping strategies that show up, all of those things for any individual, the coping strategies may look like avoidance, or they may look like addictions the things not like drugs and alcohol that we're very clear are addictions, but how we are with food, people who become gamblers, people who overwork, people who get addicted to pornography or to sex or to attention craving or a whole list of others that when you look, you will maybe see these showing up around you in how people function, and that affects the workplace. And any of them or all of them may also be affecting how people are relating to each other in the family systems that come towards you, and to the tensions and the behavior patterns that show up there. Okay, I'm going to pause before I go into the next bit because I've been bombarding you with a lot of information. And I just want to check kind of how are you doing with that? Is this making sense? Is there anything which you feel I've totally confused you with? And so it's a chance for you to kind of just say if that's what's happened and if you want to ask any questions about any confusion that's showing up.
It's very rich and very resonant, and it all makes sense from where I'm sat and is kind of connecting to other speakers we've also had. It's yeah, so it's making a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Sheena. That's
I
good to hear.
absolutely agree with what Sheena says. It's really, I'm having aha moments. Thank you.
Lovely. That's really good to hear. So what we're going to move towards now is a little bit more of a sense of, okay, well, if that's what's showing up and if that's what's in the system, what is it possible to do about that? So this is where we really start to engage with the system from a different angle. And Francisco Varela is a biologist who what you see, he's written actually about biological systems in the world, but it applies totally to organizational systems and even to individual, to your bodies as an individual system. There is no whole system without an interconnection of its parts, and there is no whole system without an environment. So what is a system? So this picture of a thumb doesn't really feel probably like a system. It doesn't to me, though you could break it down to the components that sort of make it one. But it becomes significant when you look at the whole hand, because the whole hand, it does function as a system. There are lots of different things that it does, and that all the different parts work and articulate together. And if that isn't kind of obvious to you, I want you to think of what it was like if you ever cut your finger. So where you cut just one finger and all of a sudden you can't actually use your hand the way you're used to using it. The whole system is affected by something that impacts just one part of it. And then I want to take a bigger sense of what a system is by looking at what systems do, because that's actually what makes a system significant as a system, is that it's what it does. And I've used this image, this picture of hands, because one of my interests is in evolution. And you may have come across this notion that the thing which distinguishes human beings and the anthropoid apes from the rest of the animal kingdom is this thing called the opposable thumb. So it's the opposable thumb which made it possible for us to do manipulation and tool use and the things that we do that make it different than just having a paw. I mean, squirrels are pretty smart creatures. They're probably one of the smartest creatures on the planet in some ways in their problem solving capability. But there's limitations to what they can do. They can sort of hold a nut while they nibble it, but they can't do what we do in manipulation. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because what it means is something which goes beyond what the system does, but what it means for what it takes to control that complexity, to manage all that complexity, to articulate it. So, the nature of that adaptation, the nature of the opposable thumb, was that we evolved, our brains evolved out of or alongside the ability that we had to do more with this more complicated organ. And there's research that shows that the greater, the longer the thumb, if you go back through kind of other apes and so on, and through the archaeological history, the longer the thumb, the bigger the brain. So what that tells us is that as our ancestors got better at gripping and manipulating objects, their brains had to expand to keep up. And the other thing to see that's on this slide is that the correlation of brain expansion was not with the movement centers in the brain. The expansion is in the capacities associated with thinking and planning and consciousness. They're in the neocortex. And why that's relevant to what we're talking about is that it also applies to organizations. So if you're looking at what does it take to adapt as a living system, as a living system of an organization, and to see the hospice as that whole, as something which is kind of ongoing and kind of changing as it moves on its, on its two legs, is to understand, well, what does that take? If we're going to evolve as organizations and to become more capable, what is it that's going to effectively rewire the organizational brain? So just to go back again to the organizational lenses on the world, all of those aspects are present within that living system, whether you're solvent, whether you have your sense of purpose, whether there's an empowerment for the organization to shape itself and to kind of forge its independent future. Are the working practices and everything that goes with those, are they fully fit for purpose? How are you managing the relationship between reliability and quality systems in a context of rigidity or flexibility? How do you adapt to that, both on a day-to-day basis and in the evolution of the organization as it has to meet different conditions? So we're needing to look at the organization through this sense of these different lenses: reputation, marketability, how good are we at caring? How does our care show up not just for our patients, but for ourselves and for the system as a whole? And how do we deliver more well-being in all areas? Because just as each stage, each layer was a foundational harmonic of individual coherence, in the organization, all of these layers need to be present. The voices need to be speaking in a healthy way, and there needs to be balance across all of them. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through this. This is the four-quadrant view of our individual interiors and our individual exteriors. So what's in our personal values and what's in our capabilities and how we show up and what we deliver. And then there's also the collective of what's the organizational values, the organizational ethos, the culture we build, and what's the external of that collective in terms of the structures and the constraints and the hierarchies that determine organizational actions. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but I do want to point out what's at the center, because it may be the smallest of the circles, but it's absolutely foundational, because you're doing all of what you do for a purpose. And I've labeled that purpose as care. I mean, you would obviously expand that label to include quite a lot of other things, but care for the patients, care for families is at the center. Sorry, I haven't moved the slide, have I? Beg your pardon. Okay, so yeah. So I've talked about the individual, the personal values, the individual delivery, the collective, the ethos, the organizational actions, and at the center is this smaller circle that in a way encompasses them all, which is the purpose for which you're doing all of these things. So, the top left quadrant is about the motivations and the intentions that you show up with. And, that's what sits within that label of personal values. The bottom left is how those may show up and kind of sum collectively to something which is coherent, or maybe not sum to something which is coherent, which is the relationship with the organizational ethos. How does that express itself? If you have a mission statement or or something that's equivalent to that, how does the individual sit within that? How does that harmonize? The bottom right, the collective external, the structures, systems, and work processes, you will know very well, and probably, with some degree of pain in some cases, what those structures are and constraints are, and how they actually affect your ability to work, and how they each of these quadrants has a relationship with each of the others. There's potential tensions, potential harmonies. So I'm just expressing these not because you need to understand them in depth at this point, but because they become ways of just looking at an organization and having a sense of what does this say about the questions that we might be looking to ask of ourselves? Because ultimately, this is not an analytical process. It may sound like that, but the analysis is really what it takes just to see more clearly what are the questions we need to ask. because, as Gabor Mate says, we are wounded in relationship and must therefore also heal in relationship. Yet the modern world increasingly isolates the mother, the child, and the family. And the extension of that into organizations is that it isolates people within organizations from each other, from the organization itself, from the wider world and society. And so that kind of brings the question of, well, how and where can healing happen? Sorry, I didn't move my slide again. But I think I narrated what's on there. So again, when a living system, this is Francesco Varela, when a living system is suffering from ill health, the remedy is found by connecting with more of itself. And I kind of want to leave this sitting there for 5 or 10 minutes for you to take it in, and I don't have 5 or 10 minutes, so I'd really encourage you to just look at it, take it in, come back to it when you have the slides to look at, and have a sense of what does this mean? Because our history is one of tending to think that whatever these problems are, we or somebody else, we have to come in from the top and fix them. We come in from outside. And what I'm encouraging with this whole systemic point of view is the understanding that to whatever extent that strategy might have used to work in simpler times and with simpler systems, it doesn't work anymore because there's just too much complexity, there's too much that moves too fast, and too much that is existing in the space of the relationships that we really have to find a different way to engage with. And that starts with the recognition that it is a living system, that it's not some set of nuts and bolts or widgets or people in boxes that are described as roles. It's a living system where all of those things are relational. They're all operating in relation to each other. And so the goal then becomes how do we find our ways of getting our systems to see more of themselves? And that may be, done a little bit at a time, but somehow we have to bring more of that reconnection into the open and understand that what that means are both potentially physical changes around what people do and the processes they do them by, and attitude changes around how they do it. And so the change that is going to be required is built from developing and fostering those smaller changes or those particular areas of change. They may be initially to one team or to one process that you use for how you deal with patients or how you deal with families. This is not something that you can do kind of wholesale or all at once. It's an evolutionary journey. And so it involves making space for a rewiring of the system's connection, the growth of its intelligence. This is where you build the brain, you build the internal capacities that the organization it has for itself to solve its own problems from within, from what it is, and from effectively from who you are. And in this sense, every organizational journey is distinct and different because you are who you are. So as you do that, the attention to all the layers and all the quadrants, that becomes part of the texture of what you operate with. It becomes of the spaces where you may be saying, okay, what's the question here? What's the question here? But you're not looking for an answer from that is structural and analytical. You're looking for how do we respond to this from our place of what we know about who we are and what can we see of ourselves. And so you're, building all of this piece by piece over a period of time. And in saying that, it may seem like, oh, I'm not coming along with a formula that I can present to you, but that actually the fact that there isn't one is the advantage. It may not sound like it, but it is the advantage. And it's a shift from the usual way of thinking about an organization where people have tried for management efficiencies and they've restructured and they've reshaped everything from the top down, and still the problems remained the same within. I mean, any of you, if you've been in the National Health Service for years, you will have listened to governments talking about how they're going to fix all those problems in that way, and you know how much that didn't work. So the purpose of working this way is to allow your organization to find its own intelligence, to reduce the extent to which it needs external support to do that. So you learn the ways of behaving that enable you to solve those kind of managerial problems as a collective. It enables you to discover your own priorities in what you do first and what you do next. And you do what you can when you can, because my experience with the Sheeling School is that it's been through a decade. I mean, I've been with it, as I think Jeanette said, for 20 years. But the last decade, or maybe slightly more than a decade, it's been through a gradual process of dealing with these kinds of issues one by one, bit by bit, to the point where it can not only kind of pass an Ofsted and be rated as good or sometimes excellent, but where what the people who do the inspection say of the organization is, we've never seen anything like this. We want you to share how you do what you do with others. And that's because building the organization, and I'm not responsible for that. I have to say there's a quite brilliant principal who really understood what this took and has, all I've done is kind of support. That this is a way of change that if you're willing and able to take the time, that's what works. So how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And you know that your organization needs to keep doing its job. It's not easy for you in your context even to get the time to work on the organization. It's like trying to fix the puncture on a bicycle while you're still riding it. It's not easy, but you can find ways to do it. You can start by finding where are the biggest pain points and where are quick wins. And just knowing you're working in the context that a culture shift takes time. And that what you're dealing with in working this way is with a qualitative change. Most focus in the past has been on quantitative change, but dealing with relationships and culture is about the quality of what you do and how you do it and what inhabits that. So that's my end point, which of course it's like the word that the Americans use when students graduate. They call it a commencement ceremony. This is actually where stuff starts, not where it finishes. I want to kind of open it to you to ask any questions that are coming up, and how you might engage with kind of what's on this slide.
Thank you so much, John. It's so rich. I know we're not all in the same room, but it feels like there's just sort of like a bit of silence as everyone kind of absorbs the impact of it. Could I just read out that quote you shared again? When a living system is suffering from ill health, the remedy is found by connecting more with itself. It's very beautiful. And as you read that, I just realized actually how much I love this hospice. It's such a heart-opening experience to hear you describe this way of looking at organizations as a living being, really. So, do we have any questions?
I'm going up to Genevieve in a minute. Yeah.
Oh, I think, Valerie, that might not have been a question, but you might not be on mute.
I think sometimes the mute buttons, I've had this in other meetings as well, that people have unmuted and then it somehow reverts to being unmuted. So yeah, Valerie, I'll just mute you, and if you want to say something, you can unmute yourself again.
So do we have questions? I have one, whilst people might be formulating their own thoughts. So the idea of like the impact of an opposable thumb on the kind of intelligence of a system. I guess I was kind of coming into this session feeling like my sphere of influence just feels like it's got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller within the organization, and like feeling like not even like the edge of a pinky. And I think most of us here are practitioners on the whole face rather than feeling like the brain. I don't feel like the brain. I feel like a tiny pinky, maybe pinky toenail, something like that. So like what does that, I'm trying to work out what that might mean for me, apart from the heart opening experience of seeing this organization as a living, breathing being. I'm trying to kind of translate that to my day-to-day life.
Yes, I'm aware in kind of saying these things to, as you say, people who are at the coalface and not maybe to their managers, that they're that creates, at least to start with, limitations. So you can only start from where you are with what's in front of you. So that may be, one or two colleagues or a team or a subsystem within the overall system, and you apply what you have, and what you understand to the learning about, so as the nail, you start to learn about the pinky, and you affect the pinky. And there's no guarantee to this. I mean, it may be that the only improvement you get is to the pinky, but that's an improvement. What's good is when that starts to become visible and maybe somebody else starts to say, oh, what did you do there? How can I do that to the index finger? And maybe you find, the managers who are open to hear the message, and that who are willing to engage with the conversation and to start assisting the articulation from a level up, or even two levels up, I mean, that's when things really can happen on a much bigger scale. Like I said, with the Shieling School, having a principal uh, who really gets. I mean, I've never explained to her what I've explained to you today. She just has an interior sense of what that living is, and that's because the Shieling is it's informed by Steiner anthroposophy, and when people actually live that, they understand the relationship between the individual and the collective. They understand what it is to when there's a recognition that the person who is cared for is also there, they're a teacher for you too. And so that's kind of built into their environment as part of their founding ethos, and it's built into how she thinks. But there's no reason that any of you can't borrow that context or start to operate from that space of becoming relational. I mean, there is a whole different way of looking at the world, which is kind of my passion, is talking about relational being, which has to do with the fact that we all tend to get into this object-oriented universe where there's us and there's others. But the reality of the universe is that everything is operating in relation to everything else. And the way that we make changes is when we increasingly move into operating in that space of relationship. Yeah, I won't go on about that. I'll
Thank
just
you.
leave it
Yeah,
at that.
it feels very true. I appreciate that. Thank you. I wonder if you stop sharing, we might be able to see everybody that's in the room. Oh, there we are. There's everybody. That's lovely. Thanks, Jon.
Bex has a question.
Hi, yeah, I don't know if it's a question or if it's more just a comment.
Okay.
But it's sort of building on what Sheena said and your response to it, and feeling like being quite powerless in your organization or not having a large sphere of influence. But I found it really comforting when you were talking about the individual stages of development. Sorry if I get that.
No, that's right.
That was right. And then the organizational ones, and how that it's individually I can see what you were talking about, that how you kind of go between wanting to be part of the collective and then wanting to be individual. But that's actually quite natural to go between the two that you're going. And it just made me think that as an employee in an organization, I think just to be reminded of that it's natural to sometimes be feeling very individual and sometimes to be feeling and then trying to be part of the collective, that you will vacillate between that, and that it's not something that's wrong, but it's kind of natural. Because I think if I think about the times when I've been stuck in a bit of a rut or something in work, it's maybe because I felt either like I don't like how they're doing everything and I'm going to do it my way, or other times when I felt like I'm going to do exactly what the ethos of this place is, because I want to fit in and I want to, and it kind of going against myself a bit in some ways. I don't know if this is making sense or I'm rambling.
Totally.
But I just thought just to recognize that that is natural, rather than maybe that's maybe a way of growth is to do that, but finding a way to get better at it as you go on. Does that, rather than seeing it as a something, this is I need to, yeah, I'm going to stop there. That was just sort of just saying, it was quite a comforting thought that made me just think about how, that's how I react often. And maybe that's okay. That's sort of, sometimes you don't feel in line with the organization and sometimes you really do. And yeah.
Yeah.
That was all.
It's a fundamental of life. It's a fundamental of how the world evolved as a dance between competition and collaboration. It's how living systems actually arose in the first place. I mean, I don't know whether any of you have seen some of the stuff that's been coming in recent years about forests and mycorrhizal fungi and the way that we thought we were looking at individual trees, and actually we were looking at whole networks of intercommunication between multiple different beings that were kind of mediated by the things that we thought were so small that we could ignore them. And so it's that the notion of how systems collaborate and how they're taking care of both the individual and the system. And the tree still has to grow in relation to the light that's available to it and the space that's available to it. It has to be the individual tree that it is. So this is so fundamental. And what has happened with the way that our human, our values, our systems have evolved is that we have thought that we were choosing between one and the other. So we've had actually periods of history where blue was absolutely central and everybody had to do what the Catholic Church said that they should do. There wasn't any space for individuality. And then we had the Industrial Revolution that comes after that, in which you have that explosion of focus on the material world and the denial of any spiritual context, and everybody being out for themselves, that you end up with the Elon Musks of the world. These things are absolutely built in to what it has been to be human. And so the challenge of integration, of reaching yellow, is exactly what you've described, Bex, that we have to learn actually to dance the dance of being an individual, being in collective, not thinking that one of those is right and the other is wrong. And I'll just say one more thing about being small and about empowerment. That there's a well-known feature in the system that operates between red and green. And because typically people who do the work that you do are strongly inhabiting a green system around your motivation towards care and towards being with others, often that system has a blind spot around red and around empowerment. And so it's quite a useful thing, if you care to do so, to observe where maybe you put your individuality second because of your service to the caring, when actually what would happen if you put your empowerment more in the service of the integration and of the whole, so that you could have your green and your red empowerment operating together, and you didn't disempower yourself by the way you think about what you are supposed to do or be. Does that make sense? That's
Yes, it does. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
really
totally.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm so glad this is recorded so I could go back and listen to that
Yeah.
bit again. That's really helpful. Yeah. I have some questions from my team who couldn't be here, and I'm just wondering whether I'm just going to look through, sorry, all my notes. Oh, yeah, here's a good one. How to find our power when we're feeling pretty powerless. That's kind of very relevant to what you were just describing.
It is. And my first response would be that it's an inside job. That when you
Okay.
believe you're powerless, then you very likely make yourself powerless. But there's also the outside part of that of, okay, what is it that you might need to challenge in the system, in the environment, where the system is disempowering you and where you are not being given the voice that actually you deserve and that would benefit the system.
I'm writing it down. Thank you.
Yeah, it's fine.
Does this speak to the place of organizations within the wider environment as well? You know, external criteria that organizations need to meet, you know, targets they have to meet to get funding and so on. I don't know if you want to say anything, because that's a constraint, isn't it?
Very much so. I mean, one of the things that we were engaging with at the Sheeling in the early days of Ofsted was the notion of how do we tick the boxes our way rather than the way that they think we're supposed to tick them. So,
Mm.
how do you find your degrees of freedom within what are often fairly rigid or at least rigid looking systems? How do how do you stretch that rigidity of the context as best you can? And yeah, that's the game. That's where the dance between the competition and the collaboration, because in a sense, you're placed in competition with the forces of management and control, which of course have their own reasons to exist. There are reasons why governments have to do their best to balance their budgets. And okay, they may make a lot of strange priority calls in that and have different senses of what the best thing to do is that are different than what I would think or what you might think. But they also are operating within certain constraints of reality. So, we're all having to dance with the stretch of reality.
Wow. I think we're coming towards the end of our meeting. Are there any last minute observations, questions, thoughts that anybody wants to throw in?
Just wanted to read out Nana's comments because she needed to leave, and John, you might not get a chance to hear it. Thank you very much, John. It was a very helpful presentation. As a systemic therapist, I strongly resonate with these ideas. Sadly, she needs to leave now, but it'd be really useful to continue this conversation. And I guess we could do that on the network. Most of the hospices are now in survival mode. So how do we sustain all the other levels of thinking and operating?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough.
Yeah. What is good is we do have our network, and I feel like this is kind of sparking off lots of thoughts that, I'd invite us to kind of spill over into, because there is potential for community there and connection. We can be trees in a forest, so let's be trees in a forest.
Yeah, and we will need support. You know, we all feel disempowered at times, and it's very important to feel that you're not in it on your own, you know.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, so it it leaves me to thank you, John, for an amazing talk. I mean,
Yes.
so rich and, you know, so much to go back over and digest and hopefully you've planted seeds in all of us that will take fruit in our respective organizations. Um, we'll get the recording uploaded. I'll try and rectify the bit at the beginning. I'm sorry I forgot to press the record button. And we'll upload it on the platform as soon as possible. We'll send a message out to everyone with the link. And it's free to share with anyone. It's even if they're not part of the network. So put it out there as far as you can and share it with your senior management teams. If you think they're interested, let's make the impact as big as it can be. Our next meeting is a community of practice meeting on the 13th of January, again at 1 o'clock UK time. So hopefully see you there. And that will be by Sheena, our own Sheena, as you see there, and her colleague Fran Lowell. And it will be about neurodivergence, trauma, and palliative care. So that will also be a very important and interesting talk. So that's all from us, and thank you so much for coming. Anything anyone else still wants to say? Then thank you again, Jon. Really fantastic.
It's a pleasure. I like talking about this stuff, as you've probably noticed.
Well, that's to our benefit. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Lovely to see you all. Yeah.
Thanks
Hopefully
so
see you
much for
next
coming,
time.
everyone. Thank you. It's really great. Thank you, Jon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.